Hello everyone, I'm Professor Matthew Rimmer. I am based at the QT Faculty of Law in Australia, in the Sunshine State of Brisbane. Tonight I'm going to talk about the people's vaccine, intellectual property and access to essential medicines in the age of COVID. Before I kind of begin in earnest, I would first like to note that at QT we recognise the contribution of Indigenous elders, past, present and future, and acknowledge that QT has long been a site of Indigenous research and Indigenous learning. And it's kind of been striking in the Australian context. You know, there was a lot of concern about the outbreak of the coronavirus amongst Indigenous communities and Indigenous First Nations in Australia. And I think one of the very pleasing things about Australia's strong public health response in relation to the coronavirus has been the focus on ensuring the public health of Indigenous communities. Much thanks to some of the Indigenous public health leaders in that space. To begin with, I just want to give you a little bit of a sense of some of the history about intellectual property and access to essential medicines. I kind of came to this topic a couple of decades ago. I just finished my PhD, and in the front of the newspapers at the time, there were these titanic struggles playing out between the South African government and 39 of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies. And they were kind of fascinating disputes that were kind of erupting. And Nelson Mandela's government was trying to get access to generic medicines from India. And in response, pharmaceutical drug companies brought an action against Nelson Mandela's government in the South African courts. The matter was not only just a question about patent law, but it was also a question about human rights. South Africa has a next generation regime in relation to human rights, so there were kind of larger arguments about the right to property and the right to health. And there was a kind of tremendous public outcry about the action by the pharmaceutical drug companies. The Treatment Action Campaign led by Zaki Ahmed did a very good job at publicising the controversy, not only in South Africa, but globally. And in the end, the pharmaceutical drug companies were kind of shamed into withdrawing the action. And then for a brief while, there were a number of efforts to reconcile nation states about intellectual property and access to essential medicines. So in 2001, the WTO recognised the Doha Declaration, and the Doha Declaration was essentially an acknowledgement that member states could use flexibilities within intellectual property regimes to deal with public health challenges, especially national emergencies and public health epidemics, such as HIV, AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. In 2003, there was a further WTO General Council decision which provided for an export mechanism. So it enabled compulsory licensing to be used to export medicines to those countries that lacked a local manufacturing capacity. This was kind of used once by Apotex in Canada to send HIV medicines to Rwanda. Even though that regime has not been used very frequently, nonetheless, it's kind of been embedded into the TRIPS agreement. There was hope that such efforts would resolve some of the conflicts over intellectual property and access to essential medicines. But in fact, over the years, we've really seen these conflicts and disputes kind of play out in a range of different arenas and across a variety of different places and jurisdictions. We've also seen the emergence of a range of new infectious diseases. I wrote back in 2004 a piece on the race to patent the Sars virus, which when I look back is a very kind of uncanny piece of research. I was really interested in the efforts that were made to genetically sequence the Sars virus by the Centre for Diseases in the United States, the British Columbia Cancer Agency in Vancouver in Canada, and the University of Hong Kong, all sequenced the Sars virus around the same time and sought patents at the same time in relation to the Sars virus, supposedly for defensive purposes. So they wanted to stop others from using and exploiting the research that they had done, particularly kind of commercial companies. There's a great sense of deja vu on my part in terms of looking at the current controversies over intellectual property and the coronavirus, looking back at what happened in relation to the Sars virus. And we had some similar patent races kind of play out with the rise of avian influenza, the Ebola outbreak, and the Zika virus. And I guess the unfortunate thing has been, in many ways, we have repeated some of the past conflicts that have taken place over access to medicines in new contexts as they came along. Ban Ki-moon made a kind of concerted effort at the end of his term to try to develop some common understandings around intellectual property and access to essential medicines. So he gathered together various dignitaries and eminent people and jurists and lawyers to issue a report, the UN high-level panel report on access to medicines, and that recognised that there are a number of things that nation states could do to take action on access to medicines. They could make use of TRIPS flexibilities in terms of intellectual property trade rules. They could also make use of open access, open medicine, open health and open data. There was an opportunity to kind of build public health institutions and set in place mechanisms for accountability and transparency. And unfortunately, that kind of landmark report did not find favour with some developed countries like the United States, or with some of the pharmaceutical drug companies and some of the biotechnology companies. So that kind of brings us up to date to the present conflicts that have broken out in relation to intellectual property and the coronavirus. And I guess there have been a number of great concerns about some of the intellectual property activities in this particular space. To keep it simple, one of the great concerns has been that of vaccine nationalism. So instead of nation states banding together and taking a cooperative, collaborative approach to developing COVID treatments, there's been a concern that particular nation states will go it alone and try to develop technologies, primarily for the benefit of their own population. And the concern is that such an approach will lead to some quite discriminatory outcomes. You know, in particular, there is a concern that certain very developed countries will benefit from such arrangements, and developing countries and least developed countries will be slow to gain access to such COVID technologies as vaccines, treatments, and diagnostics. So there's been a lot of concern, particularly in relation to a number of states and their approach in relation to vaccine nationalism. So obviously there's been a lot of concern about the approach of the Trump administration. The Trump administration has taken an America First approach. They have supported the national operation of Operation Warp Speed. There is a grand ambition to make huge amounts of vaccine doses available in the United States by the end of the year. The United States, though, has not supported some of the international initiatives to provide for the sharing of technologies, such as CTAP and the ACT Accelerator, which have been sponsored by the World Health Organization. Likewise, there's also been a concern that the United States has been trying to pick up some of the key intellectual property of key vaccine developers around the world. So there was a bit of a conflict between the United States and Germany over a German biotechnology company's work. There seemed to be an approach by the United States to try to acquire a key German company. Should be noted that the United States is not the only country of which there has been concerns about vaccine nationalism. There's been a lot of worry about Russia steaming ahead, developing a vaccine, releasing a vaccine without going through proper clinical trials. There's been a lot of concern that some countries have played a double game. So while the European Union has kind of talked about the importance of global public goods, at the same time, many European countries have entered into special procurement deals with pharmaceutical drug companies and vaccine developers. So there has been a concern of double standards in terms of the approach to access to vaccines. And there's also been a lot of debate about the position of China in relation to vaccine development and what its position might be in relation to vaccine development, and whether or not it will take a nationalist approach or whether it will join in some of the more cooperative efforts in relation to vaccine development. At the same time, there's also been concern about big pharma profiteering in relation to intellectual property related to COVID technologies. So there is a concern that some of the patterns that we've seen in the past, in which pharmaceutical companies, biotech developers, and medical companies monopolize key technologies, charge high prices for drugs and vaccines and diagnostics, and sometimes charge very high rates in relation to developing countries and least developed countries. There has been a great worry that those sorts of patterns will take place in relation to COVID technologies. It was kind of telling that in the same week that the United States Patent and Trademark Office Director was denying that there were any intellectual property problems in relation to access to COVID technologies, that there was litigation breaking out over some of the intellectual property in respect of some of the high-level drugs and treatments that President Trump had been taking in response to COVID. So there's a great kind of concern about untrammeled capitalism leading to quite inequitable outcomes in relation to access to future COVID technologies, vaccines, treatments, and diagnostics. And there has been a push from many different quarters to try to set in place some mechanisms and institutions that will help encourage cooperative and collaborative approaches to the development of COVID technologies. And the hope is that some of these strategies might avoid some of the past conflicts that we've seen in relation to intellectual property. So we kind of want to avoid a repeat of the patent rivalries that took place in the 1980s between the United States and France over developing a HIV/AIDS diagnostic. We want to kind of avoid the massive conflicts that we've seen in relation to HIV/AIDS medicines in respect of South Africa, but also elsewhere around the world. So we want to ensure that there's not the unruly competition and rent seeking that we've seen in the past. And in my presentation today, I really want to kind of take you through a whistle-stop tour of some of the policy options and strategies that have been put forward over the past year. They include the proposal for a people's vaccine, the construction of an ACT Accelerator, to help promote global public goods. I want to talk about Costa Rica's policy innovation and its development of the coronavirus technology access pool. I want to briefly kind of mention the medicines patent pool. I also want to talk about such flexibilities as compulsory licensing and Crown use and government use, and the push by the student-run organisation Universities Allied for Essential Medicines for public sector licensing. I'd like to kind of briefly applaud the leadership of the Creative Commons in managing the Open COVID Pledge as a kind of a strategy to encourage intellectual property owners to pledge not to take intellectual property action against others. I'd also like to kind of talk about some of the possibilities in relation to open access, open medicine and open science as providing a different route to encourage global cooperation and collaboration in relation to COVID technologies. And finally, I'd like to wrap up talking about the proposal in the past week to the TRIPS Council by India and South Africa for there to be a waiver of key parts of the TRIPS agreement during the COVID pandemic. As I mentioned in my presentation last evening, there has been a lot of debate about some of the ramifications for that for copyright law and access to knowledge, but also the waiver has implications for patents and access to essential medicines as well. As we go along, feel free to chat in terms of the chat session that is kind of available in terms of the session. I have kind of mentioned that I put an array of materials available in the program, including some of my own work, copy of the slides, and access to some of the key international documents. If you have any questions or queries, please type away in terms of the session, and I'll try to respond at the end of the session to some of your thoughts. Also, I think it's a good opportunity for you to kind of share any policy innovations that have been going on in your nation states or countries from where you're kind of based. It's a great opportunity to share some of our knowledge and experience in terms of policy innovations to combat the COVID crisis. And I'd also note that if you're not on Australian time or if you kind of missed the talk, I've also put up a link to an earlier version of the presentation that I did a few months ago. But let me get into the bulk of the presentation. And I really want to kind of begin by focusing upon the push for a people's vaccine. And in this space, we should be very grateful for some of the work of the civil society organisation Oxfam, together with UNAIDS, who have pushed for the concept of a people's vaccine. They have contended that governments and international partners must unite around a global guarantee, which ensures that when a safe and effective vaccine is developed, that it is produced rapidly, at scale, and made available for all people in all countries, free of charge. They've also called for a similar approach to other treatments, diagnostics, and technologies related to COVID-19. The key figure leading this push is the most impressive UNAIDS Executive Director and former leader of Oxfam, Winnie Byanyima. She has kind of emphasised that to respond to COVID-19, we need a people's vaccine, not a profits vaccine. And this is partly informed by her own experience. She was very devastated by generations of her friends being affected by the lack of access to HIV medicines during the HIV AIDS epidemic. And she recalls that with AIDS, we saw that when treatments were found, the wealthier people in wealthier countries got back to health, while millions of people in developing countries were left to die. We must not repeat the same mistake when a vaccine for COVID-19 is found. The right to health is a human right. It should not depend on the money in your pocket or the colour of your skin to be vaccinated against this deadly virus. A vaccine should be a global public good and free of charge for all. She has sought to frame the question of the people's vaccine in terms of human rights, the right to health, universal health care, the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as larger considerations about equity, equality and justice. She has observed that UNAIDS and other members of the People's Vaccine Alliance are calling for a new approach that puts public health first by sharing knowledge and maximising supply to make sure that no one is left behind. She feared that anything short of that will lead to more deaths and economic chaos, forcing millions into destitution. Winnie has been supported by Helen Clark, the former Labor Prime Minister of New Zealand and the former leader of the United Nations Development Programme. She was kind of an unsuccessful candidate for the position of the United Nations Secretary General, and she is currently being charged with the job of reviewing the response of the World Health Organization to the coronavirus. Helen and Winnie have expanded upon the case for a people's vaccine in a piece for The Guardian. The pair maintain that granting one company exclusive rights to the science, know-how and intellectual property of a coronavirus will prevent us from getting the billions of doses that the world needs. They argue that this extraordinary moment calls for a better approach than our current regime of monopoly rights. They suggest, aside from insisting on the sharing of knowledge and intellectual property, rich countries should be urgently financing the rapid expansion of safe manufacturing capacity in developing countries. Helen Clark has added, faced with this crisis, we cannot carry on business as usual. The health of each of us depends on the health of all of us. The COVID-19 vaccine must not belong to anyone and must be free for everyone. Diplomatic platitudes are not enough. We need legal guarantees, and we need them now. It's also notable that Helen Clark's protege, Jacinda Ardern, has had one of the most successful public health responses to the coronavirus around the world. And Jacinda Ardern has just been re-elected as Prime Minister of New Zealand. And she has also been very committed to an approach which emphasises the importance of access to essential medicines. So I think there is much to learn from the New Zealand public policy response to access to essential medicines. And I think Helen Clark has played a very important role as an elder stateswoman in terms of talking about the importance of such an approach. The call for a people's vaccine has also been supported by other civil society organisations like Public Citizen. It's also been supported by notable economists, health advocates and others, such as the former President of Ireland, Mary Robinson, Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, the director of the African Centres for Disease Control and Prevention, the Special Rapporteur on the right to everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. That has been very kind of striking as well. The People's Vaccine Alliance has also gathered together various other supporters of a people's vaccine. In a kind of a moving and striking letter, survivors of the coronavirus from 37 countries have lent their support to a letter. The signatories included 242 COVID survivors from South Africa to Finland, from New Zealand to Brazil. The signatories also included 190 people in 46 countries who have lost relatives to the virus, and 572 signatories with underlying health conditions which made them vulnerable to COVID-19. The letter said, some of us have lost loved ones to this killer disease. Some of us have come close to death ourselves. Some of us are continuing to live in fear that contracting this disease would be fatal for us. We see no justification why your profit or monopolies should mean anyone else should go through this. The letter calls for a different approach to carrying on with business as usual, defending monopolies while refusing to share research and know-how. And the survivors of COVID call on industry leaders to ensure COVID vaccines and treatments reach everyone who needs them by preventing monopolies, ramping up production and sharing knowledge. One of the signatories, Delafruz Gafarova, age 43, from Tajikistan, discussed the difficulties that her family faced during the coronavirus outbreak. She said, "Me and my husband got sick with this disease. We could only rely on ourselves as hospitals were full. It was really difficult to get the right medicines. I'm the mother of 4 children. I was afraid to leave them alone in this world if something bad could happen with me. The reason I'm signing this letter is to help others to get a vaccine. Not all the people around the world can get this vaccine as they simply cannot afford it. They hardly have enough to meet their daily needs." Heidi Chow from Global Justice Now, member of the People's Vaccine Alliance, said the industry cannot block its ears to these voices, but should respond immediately by ending their monopolies and commit to sharing manufacturing know-how. There's also been a number of national leaders who supported the call for a people's vaccine. The president of South Africa, in particular, said that billions of people today await a vaccine. That is our best hope of ending this pandemic. As the countries of Africa, we are resolute that the COVID-19 vaccine must be patent-free, rapidly made and distributed and free for all. All the science must be shared between governments. Nobody should be pushed to the back of the vaccine queue because of where they live or what they earn. And more recently, the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria also supported the call and said that only a people's vaccine with equality and solidarity at its core can protect all of humanity and get our society safely running again. Imran Khan, the leader of Pakistan, also kind of talked about the importance of pooling all the knowledge, experience and resources at our disposal for the good of all humanity. Unfortunately, not all leaders have supported the call for the people's vaccine. Alan Tehoan has lamented, unfortunately, despite the lofty promises of the vaccine as a global public good, wealthy nations are not making such demands for a people's vaccine. As some recent writers, including my colleague Umberku Kelic, wrote recently, there's a real question about there being a choice between people or profit, a people's vaccine or a debilitating vaccine apartheid. One of the very kind of concrete options that have been put forward has been the establishment of a new institution called the ACT Accelerator. The ACT Accelerator is a global collaboration being led by the World Health Organization to accelerate the development, production, and equitable access to new COVID-19 diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. The new institution was launched at the end of April 2020. According to the World Health Organization, the goal of the ACT Accelerator is to end the COVID pandemic as quickly as possible by reducing COVID-19 mortality and severe disease through the accelerated development, equitable allocation, and scaled up delivery of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics to reduce mortality and severe disease, restoring full societal and economic activity globally in the near term, and facilitating high-level control of COVID-19 disease in the medium term. The World Health Organization has emphasized that a key principle underpinning the ACT Accelerator is the need for equitable distribution of COVID-19 tools to those most in need. The World Health Organization comments that whether a person can access tests, treatment, and a vaccine for COVID-19 should not be determined by where they live. A number of nation states, philanthropists and civil society organisations are supporting this initiative. So the governments of Austria, Belgium, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Mexico, Morocco, New Zealand, Norway, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Spain, and the United Kingdom, and the European Commission have supported the ACT Accelerator. I think China has also kind of come on board, and a number of other countries since the initial launch. The participating global health organisations include the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, CEPI, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunisations, Gavi, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria, UNITAID, the Foundation for Innovative New Diagnostics, the Wellcome Trust, the World Bank Group, and the World Health Organization. There's been a big push by the United Nations to try to get funding for the 4 pillars of this regime. 4 pillars include diagnostics, therapeutics, vaccines, and the strengthening of the health system. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres in particular, has pleaded with nation states to help provide the $31.3 billion that is needed for the ACT Accelerator to fulfill some of its goals. The European Union and the European Commission has kind of played a very important role in terms of a pledging marathon, and they have played a very constructive role in raising finance for the ACT Accelerator. Particularly because the United States has been refusing to participate in this structure. The elder stateswoman, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, scientist by training, has emphasised that a world free of COVID-19 requires the most massive public health effort in history. Data must be shared, production capacity prepared, resources mobilised, communities engaged. These new tools must be a very clear and essential example of a global public good. So we've been very fortunate and lucky that Angela Merkel has been very supportive of the need to share knowledge and data and even intellectual property. She has said we'll only be able to overcome the pandemic if we achieve a truly global solution to the COVID crisis. She has said that this is a test of our generation's human kindness. Francis Emmanuel Macron has talked about the need for global public goods in relation to COVID, but he has also kind of qualified his comments saying that there should still be scope for recognition of intellectual property rights by pharmaceutical drug companies and biotechnology companies and diagnostic developers. So his discourse has been a little bit more mixed than Angela Merkel's. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has been very supportive of efforts to take action in relation to access to medicines. He and a number of other world leaders wrote a letter to the Washington Post pitching to the Trump administration and emphasising that where you live should not determine whether you live. And that letter emphasised that we must urgently ensure that vaccines will be distributed according to a set of transparent, equitable, and scientifically sound principles. Some of his predecessors in the Liberal Party, like Paul Martin and John Chrétien, were also strong supporters of access to medicines previously. Canada's emergency legislation in relation to COVID included things like a compulsory licensing mechanism. The current Attorney General of Canada, Professor David Lametti, is an expert in intellectual property. So Canada has made some very interesting contributions. As I said before, New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, who has been a very convincing leader across the ditch, has very plainly said that we will advocate for universal access for any treatments and vaccines. Australia's Conservative Prime Minister Scott Morrison has also made some very promising statements saying that he supports the development of a safe vaccine available to all and affordable to all. So we'll have to see how the ACT Accelerator goes in terms of a mechanism. There's also been some really important policy innovation made by some smaller nations in terms of putting forward some ideas for a new institution. And we should commend the leader of Costa Rica, Carlos Alvarado Quesada, who has been a champion of the concept of an intellectual property pool in relation to questions about approaches to sharing intellectual property. And he has made a really interesting contribution to the debate, and he has been supported in his efforts by Dr. Tedros of the World Health Organization. And together, they have argued that when a COVID-19 vaccine does become available, it should be treated as a global public good. And to that end, we are both calling on all governments to ensure that the outcomes of publicly funded COVID-19 research are affordable, available and accessible to everyone around the world. And they've said that the CTAP, the COVID Technology Access Pool, will compile in one place pledges of commitment made under the Solidarity Call to Action to voluntarily share COVID-19 health technology related knowledge, intellectual property and data. And the new institution is really designed to complement some of the existing mechanisms, such as the Medicines Patent Pool and the UN Technology Bank hosted Technology Access Partnership. It's been disappointing that some pharmaceutical drug companies and biotechnology developers have been unwilling to join this voluntary initiative thus far. Alan Terhoen has reflected that the success of CTAP will depend upon the political support it will receive. She notes that so far 40 countries have endorsed the initiative. Alan Terhoen comments that persuasion will need to come from governments and institutions that spend public resources on the development of new drugs and vaccines by demanding from their recipients that they share the IP and know-how they create with the funds with the World Health Organization, CTAP. So I think there's an important role to be played here by governments and public research organisations and companies in sharing their intellectual property in this voluntary mechanism. In many ways, this model is similar to that has been used with a fair amount of success elsewhere. So Professor Brooke Baker kind of makes the point that, you know, patent pools have long been used in a range of different circumstances, including access to medicines, in relation to information technology, and in relation to green technology. There's lots of opportunities through pulling together patents to share those technologies to kind of help take collective action and overcome some of the patent thickets and patent deadlocks and the tragedy of the anti-commons that sometimes exists in relation to patents. The Medicines Patent Pool, which was kind of set up to particularly kind of provide for pooling of patents to deal with HIV/AIDS, has also kind of said that it is willing to play a role in increasing access to life-saving products for those who need them most. The chair of the governance board has noted that she wants to ensure that the institution shares some of its expertise and some of its ability to overcome some of the tensions that sometimes exist between intellectual property owners and users. And they have a limited mandate to expand, you know, their jurisdiction to also help out in relation to intellectual property and COVID. So it'll be interesting to see how the medicines patent pool works alongside CTAP in overcoming some of the barriers and obstacles that exist in relation to patents. Of course, there are questions about, how patent pools operate and how they try to use persuasion to get intellectual property holders to share some of their technologies. But I guess that is very promising that, UNITAID and the Medicines Patent Pool are seeking to learn from some of their past experience in this particular field and apply it to the field of intellectual property and COVID. As opposed to some of these voluntary responses in terms of sharing intellectual property through CTAP or through the Medicines Patent Pool, there's also been a lot of discussion about strategies involving compulsory licensing and Crown use and government use. And such flexibilities have often been used in the past to provide for access to essential medicines, to address matters of public health, but also to deal with anti-competitive behaviour and profiteering. There has often been a lot of debate and controversy over the operation of compulsory licensing in this space. There's been debates about some of the procedural rules around compulsory licensing, as well as some of the substantive rules in this space. But it should be noted that, under the TRIPS agreement and under the Doha Declaration, member states are entitled to use patent flexibility such as compulsory licensing and Crown use or government use to address such questions of public interest. Ellen Terhune, in some of her work, has kind of documented how compulsory licensing and Crown use and government use have been invoked in the past. But sometimes the threat of compulsory licensing has been sufficient to encourage patent holders, particularly in relation to pharmaceutical drugs, to engage in bargaining. So in the past, Brazil in particular has been very successful in terms of using compulsory licensing to try to ensure that drug companies provide access to medicines on an equitable basis. So that is going to be a really important response in relation to the COVID crisis. And it's been notable that a number of countries have already indicated that they are willing to use compulsory licensing during the COVID pandemic if need be. So Canada, Israel, Ecuador, Chile, Germany and Indonesia have all indicated very early on that they're willing to use such a mechanism. Override the permission requirement from patent holders if need be to provide access to patent inventions. The Australian government has warned that it will use its Crown use powers if patent inventors engage in profiteering in respect of essential inventions. Hilary Wong of the University of California, Berkeley, has argued that there is a strong case for the use of compulsory licensing during the public health pandemic. She observes compulsory licensing as a powerful public health tool. It can be instrumental for alleviating insufficient supplies of necessary pharmaceuticals, as well as mitigating prohibitively expensive drug prices. There's been particular issues with the WTO General Council decision during the COVID pandemic. You might recall back in 2003, there was a mechanism set up to allow for the export of pharmaceutical drugs and medicines overseas through the mechanism of compulsory licensing. Many developed nations said that they wouldn't use that export mechanism. But with the pandemic, it has become apparent that many developed countries might need to draw upon such a mechanism. Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz has expressed his concern about the current operation of the export mechanism. He has said that life should always be put before profits, and never more so than in the midst of a pandemic. The WTO should not have rules that deliberately create barriers to importing needed drugs, whether it's rich countries or poor, and especially so because those rules limit the ability of firms to achieve efficient economies of scale. And he has said that the opt-out provision in Article 31 bis is protectionism at its worst, and clearly something not in the interest of any country, large or small, importer or exporter during the COVID crisis. MSF and their access campaigners also kind of discussed the importance of the use of such intellectual property flexibilities to ensure that medicines are not a luxury. They have argued that there's a need to press policymakers and political leaders to explain and define how COVID-19 medical tools can be conceived of as global public goods. The South Centre, led by Carlos Carrera, has also been doing a number of public policy pieces on how developing countries and least developed countries can make use of some of the TRIPS flexibilities. Another really important issue is that of public sector licensing. There has been a lot of public investment in respect of COVID technologies, and accordingly there has been a lot of debate as to whether such research should be made publicly accessible and available. The energetic and enthusiastic student-run universities allied for essential research have been mapping public investment in respect of COVID-19 technologies. This organisation has called upon public research institutions to free the vaccine. Clara Lau from Vanderbilt University has written a stirring op-ed about the need for universities to commit to such an approach. She has stressed that as a student, I believe that our universities have the opportunity and great responsibility to increase universal access to crucial medicines, such as the COVID-19 vaccine, especially since the research is done in our own labs. Some universities have done some very productive things, like set in place some frameworks for public sector licensing. So Stanford University has established a technology access framework, which is designed to help provide some guidelines for public sector licensing of intellectual property for the purpose of making products to prevent, diagnose and treat COVID-19 during the pandemic. And it should be noted that universities and public research organisations are playing a critical role in the development of vaccines, diagnostics and treatments to the coronavirus. So Australia's vaccine development in particular is being led by the University of Queensland, just upriver from where I'm speaking at the moment at QT. And there's been quite careful consideration by the Australian government in terms of the contracts that it's entered into in respect of the development of that vaccine. And the Australian government, to their credit, have been very mindful about some of those issues. But there's been a lot of debate in various different jurisdictions in the United Kingdom, in Ireland, and other jurisdictions around the world to ensure that publicly funded research is then shared with the public. We've already had presentations in this summit about the Open COVID Pledge, and this pledge has really provided a means of encouraging intellectual property owners to pledge not to take action for intellectual property infringement in relation to the use of their IP related to COVID technologies. A number of academics like Professor George Contreras and Professor Mark Lemley, researchers and scientists came up with this concept. Diane Peters, the General Counsel for the Creative Commons, has also been providing a great deal of leadership in this space. And I understand that Creative Commons is now taking charge of the management of this important mechanism. And I think this is a really important initiative by Creative Commons. It's really important that the Creative Commons tackle some of these larger questions about intellectual property and medicine and health and biology. And I think it behoves all the members of the open community to do their bit to help with some of the initiatives within this space. But that has been quite productive thus far, particularly with information technology companies and public research organisations. Less success thus far in kind of convincing some of the members of the medical fraternity to take the COVID pledge. So perhaps we can all do our part as commoners to help place pressure on intellectual property owners to take the pledge. But more generally, I think it's very central to the mission of the Creative Commons movement to kind of promote models of open access, open data, open medicine, open publishing, open source, and open science. Open source advocates such as Professor Joshua Pearce have advocated the use of open licensing in respect of COVID-19 technologies. There's been a wonderful new open access book called Vulnerable, which has been published, and it deals with the law, policy, and ethics of COVID-19. Professor Richard Gold, who is based at McGill University in Canada, has said that the coronavirus pandemic has shattered the status quo on drug development, and he has argued that we need to put in place models of open innovation that help network scientific and research efforts throughout the world. Along with his colleague Jeremy De Beer from the University of Ottawa, they have discussed the nexus of intellectual property, innovation, policy, and international trade. They have said that this pandemic proves the need to nuance our approaches to intellectual property and accelerate our transition to open science. And, you know, from a Canadian perspective, they have said that this is a global problem, one that Canada can only address in coordination with the international community. In the last few days for Open Access Week, the Royal Society of Canada has released a report co-authored by Richard Gold and a number of his collaborators, which has called for an open drug discovery of antivirals critical for Canada's pandemic strategy. And that has suggested that there needs to be a flexible, open, and stable, non-profit virtual drug discovery entity that coordinates and invests in a pipeline for the proactive development of antiviral drugs and possibly vaccines for viruses with pandemic potential. Just to wrap up my talk, I just want to kind of mention that India and South Africa have called for a waiver of parts of the TRIPS agreement. They have argued that in these exceptional circumstances, that the Council for TRIPS recommends, as early as possible, a waiver from the implementation, application, and enforcement of sections 1, 4, 5, and 7 of Part 2 of the TRIPS agreement in relation to the prevention, containment, or treatment of COVID-19. And that covers copyright law, designs law, patents, and confidential information. They have also argued that the waiver should apply to all WTO members, but would not prejudice the right of least developed country members under paragraph 1 of Article 66 of the TRIPS agreement. In their view, the waiver should continue until widespread vaccination is in place globally and the majority of the world's population has developed immunity. So it's an interesting submission. I have attached it to the program so you can read it for yourself. It's been supported by a number of civil society organisations. It has also been supported by organisations like the Third World Network and Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative and MSF Access. In the last day or two, the World Trade Organization has reported on that meeting, and it said that really there was a lack of consensus at the meeting. You know, the proponents, India and South Africa, argue that many countries may face institutional and legal difficulties when using TRIPS flexibilities, and now is the time for the WTO as an organisation to rise up to the collective call for defeating the pandemic. A number of countries welcomed the proposal as a contribution to the discussion, but asked for clarification on certain points, particularly regarding its practical implementation, the possible economic and legal impact. A number of developed country members opposed the waiver proposal, and they kind of denied that intellectual property rights was a barrier to accessing COVID-19 related medicines and technologies. So I'd encourage you all to have a look at that waiver proposal and kind of engage with that debate that's going on within the World Trade Organization. I've just also shared with my documents as well the joint World Trade Organization, World Health Organization, World Intellectual Property Organization report on intellectual property and access to medicines, as well as the World Trade Organization briefing note on intellectual property and access to medicines. Before fielding some questions, I just want to kind of end with a really interesting note by Professor Mara Tafik from Windsor Law School in Canada. And she has noted that the worldwide COVID-19 public health crisis highlights the inequities and biases within the international and domestic international intellectual property legal orders that were already being scrutinised prior to this extraordinary global upheaval. She contends that if countries hoard medical supplies and IP rights holders extract excessive prices for access to treatments and supplies, then the fallout from these individualistic actions will compel an alternative IP future the next time round. She suggests that if, on the other hand, the global community emerges from the COVID-19 pandemic having adopted collaborative IP strategies that ensure equitable and fair access to COVID-19 treatments and supplies, the success of this approach and the global cooperation it will have engendered will carry forward into the future. And she suggests that a post-pandemic IP legal order will be built on greater collaboration, balance and inclusion. By imposing checks and balances on individualistic and maximalist approaches, it will curb the abuses of the current IP environment, which privileges the dominant players. She contends greater cooperation among countries will level the field should any IP superpower, current or future, refuse to play by these rules. This framework will provide a fairer, stronger and more resilient system to ensure that IP facilitates rather than impedes solutions to other intractable global challenges, with the climate crisis at top of the list. We have a little bit of time left over for questions. There is a comment from Catherine that there's a lot to learn from New Zealand, and I'd certainly kind of amplify that point. I mean, I think Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has provided for a very empathetic leadership during the COVID crisis. She has also listened to scientists and researchers. So New Zealand went very quickly into a COVID lockdown and seems to be one of the early countries coming out of that lockdown and opening up its economy much more. I think New Zealand has also played a very constructive role, even though it's a small nation. It has shown a great deal of thought about how it can cooperatively help other nations achieve some of its success. It's also been very striking that New Zealand has had excellent public communication around COVID. So they've drawn upon their comedians and their visual illustrators to provide really clear public communications about what to do in the face of the COVID crisis. So that really effective public communications campaign has been really important. I listened to a great scientist from the University of Auckland who'd been leading some of the public communication campaigns on COVID, and she gave a great talk for Open Access Week in Australia and New Zealand, emphasising the need for an open access approach. And she shared all her wonderful visualizations with Creative Commons licenses that were then picked up in other jurisdictions. Other comments, Vladimir has kind of picking up some of the conversations that we had yesterday in relation to intellectual property and access to knowledge and the COVID crisis. And I agree with Vladimir that we do need to think across all the different domains of intellectual property. We need to think about copyright, we need to think about patents. In my last talk tomorrow, I'm going to talk about some of the issues around the right to repair and COVID. Carmel has made the kind of point that the most important initiative supporting COVID-related medical activities globally is the ACT Accelerator. Carmel notes that the low-income countries are already experiencing serious problems in dealing with the pandemic. Who will pay for a COVID-19 vaccine for those countries? And I guess it's very concerning that, you know, the COVID pandemic in some regions around the world is becoming even more serious. So, South America has become a big epicenter for the pandemic, which has been becoming very concerning. There's been a lot of concern about the extent to which COVID has hit India. I've been kind of reading some quite concerning reports about how India's public health system is being affected. Australia's near neighbour Indonesia has also been facing some very kind of significant challenges in relation to the COVID crisis. I mean, the very shocking thing has been the inability of the United States to respond to the COVID crisis. When I was writing about the Sars virus and thinking about other issues like Ebola and avian influenza, it was the United States that was leading the world efforts to combat their public health epidemics. I remember visiting Washington, D.C. during the Obama administration. The Obama administration was very concerned about the Ebola epidemic and how best to respond to the Ebola epidemic, and was wargaming ways and means of dealing with further public health crises. So it's been very concerning, disturbing that, the United States has been so incompetent in terms of dealing with the domestic crisis of the coronavirus, but has also been unwilling to provide international leadership in that space. And that is a great tragedy, given all their scientific knowledge and expertise of the United States research community, that we haven't been able to really build upon that expertise this time round. The Centers for Disease Control has often been the leader of efforts in relation to the coronavirus, and it hasn't provided that leadership this time round. And there's a great deal of concern as well in terms of larger questions about human rights and how segments of populations might be affected. So there's been a great deal of concern about the class-related impacts of COVID. There's a real need for there to be universal health care. Countries like the United Kingdom, which have cut into the NHS, have then seen a kind of a second and third wave of COVID strike because they have not necessarily provided for strong public health for all members of the community. There's been lots of concerns about some of the gendered impacts of COVID. There's also been a lot of concern about how certain segments of the community could be particularly vulnerable. So in Australia and New Zealand, there was a lot of concern about the impact upon Indigenous communities. Unfortunately, in Australia and New Zealand, we seem to have had a fairly good response thus far. But I'm certainly aware in South America, in Peru and Chile and Brazil, there's a great deal of concern about the impact of the coronavirus upon Indigenous communities. And in the United States, it's been very noticeable that some of the First Nations communities have been very badly affected. So if we kind of take a health for all approach and think about human rights and universal healthcare, that means ensuring that there is a strong overall response. And Winnie Byanyima from UNAIDS has not only emphasised the importance of the people's vaccine, but she has also kind of talked about lessons that we can learn from previous epidemics like HIV/AIDS. And she kind of talked about the importance of a human-centred response that focuses upon human rights, that stops discrimination, and tries to help communities and listen to communities is really important to an effective COVID response. There is a comment from Charlene, and Charlene says, I think India and South Africa's waiver proposal, though broad, can give the necessary impetus around removing some of the IP barriers for access to diagnostics and therapeutics for COVID and the subsequent vaccine whenever it comes. So that is a comment, I guess, in support of that waiver option that has been put forward by India and South Africa. We're probably just about time. If anyone has any further questions, I can answer a final one. But otherwise, I'm going to wrap it up for the session. So thank you very much for your participation in this session. And hopefully it will spur some further engagement with issues around intellectual property and access to medicines. I think the Creative Commons movement and the open community can play a really important role in terms of this field of debate. And while I think, we naturally have some expertise in this area around copyright and access to knowledge, I do think that we can improve expertise and knowledge and skills in relation to patents and access to essential medicines. I commend the work of Diane Peters and the Creative Commons movement in terms of taking the open COVID pledge forward. But I think there's a lot more that we can do in this space in terms of open access, open medicine, open science, open publishing. So I hope all the members of the audience will go away and think about ways and means in which they might be able to make a contribution to this really important debate, because it is a question of life and death in terms of whether or not we can provide proper, fair and equitable access to COVID technologies such as vaccines, treatments and diagnostics. So hopefully it will lead you to make your own contribution to the debate over a people's vaccine. So my final talk tomorrow is going to be looking at the response to the 3D printing community and the maker movement to the coronavirus crisis. And I really want to focus in on the issue of intellectual property and the right to repair in the last of my trilogy of talks on intellectual property and the coronavirus during this Creative Commons Summit. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of the summit, and there are many more talks coming along shortly dealing with a wide range of fascinating topics. So I hope you get the most out of the event. So thank you very much. All the best from Australia, and I wish you well, particularly in your struggles with the coronavirus pandemic around the world.